All right, so thank you again for joining us for Trauma-Informed Leadership, the balance of compassion and accountability. And our presenter today is Lisa Conradi. Next slide. So Lisa is the executive director of the Chadwick Center, which is the child advocacy center, which houses one of the largest trauma treatment centers in the nation. And we're here housed at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. And I say we because the Chadwick Center is actually where Caltrin is housed. So the California Training Institute and also our sister project or parent partner project, California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, we're all under the same Chadwick umbrella at Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego. Lisa has significant experience supporting service systems to become more trauma-focused, trauma-informed, including leading implementation of trauma-focused evidence-based practices. She's a licensed clinical psychologist trained on multiple evidence-based trauma-informed treatment practices. And she is the co-author of a recent book, Trauma-Informed Assessment with Children and Adolescents, Strategies to Support Clinicians. So I will turn this over to Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm so thrilled to see so many people joining us today. Today, we're really hopefully we're going to get into it, talking about what it's like to be a leader right now. Just for full disclosure, as Jennifer said, I'm the executive director here at the Chadwick Center, and I have been in a leadership position for the last approximately 15 years, and in the leadership position I'm currently in during COVID. So there's a lot of lessons learned and conversations that hopefully we can have together. I'd like to start us just with a little poll to see who we have today. So the first is a poll question on how many staff do you supervise or roll up to you? So we're seeing some responses come in. Okay, a little bit more waiting. It looks like the majority, so we have about 37% have 1 to 5 staff members, 20% have 6 to 10, 11% have 11 to 20, and 13% have more than 20, and about 19% of you currently don't have any direct reports. Great. Okay. Let's see. Great. Okay. We're going to go ahead and go on to the next poll. This is really get some information about how long you've been in a leadership position. So those of you who are in leadership positions and have staff that roll up to you, how long have you been a leader?
Lisa?
Yes.
We do not have the how long have you been a leader poll. We do have a role poll.
Okay, we'll go ahead and launch that one.
Perfect. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Right, and this was my error actually. So looking for the roles that we have. Okay, so it looks like approximately about 10% of you are executive directors, about 40% are program leaders, somewhere around 13% are program coordinators, and 37% fall into that other category. And for those who noted other, if you wouldn't mind typing in the chat what your position is. So associate director, supervisor, lead teacher, senior clinical director, regional manager, analyst, therapist, supervisor. So lots of diversity in our leaders. This is great. Senior policy advisor for trauma-informed care. Sounds like a fun job. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been really helpful in just helping me understand who we have on today's training. So we're going to go ahead and just dive into it. So what are we going to talk about today? So part one is we're just going to talk about what a trauma-informed approach to leadership is and why it's important. And a little hint is, especially for those who might have been doing a lot of training on trauma-informed care, you might be surprised. We're going to talk about the principles of trauma-informed. We're going to talk about some concrete skills and strategies to effectively implement a trauma-informed leadership approach, and highlight the challenges and pitfalls that leaders will likely come across as you go to implement this work. So let's talk about Maria. Maria is a director at a mid-size family resource center located in Central California. Maria, by the way, is not a real person, so nobody should assume that this is based on anybody. But let's imagine she's been at the FRC for 15 years and has had many different positions. And she became the director in November of 2019, which we all know the time frame on that. A couple months later, COVID happened, and everything we knew about leadership started to change. She has about 7 direct reports, but she has 30 staff who roll up to her. Okay, so as we said, she started in her role, and about 4 months later, COVID happened, and that she underwent a lot of changes, staff changes, some profound shifts in her staff and the workforce over the last 2.5 years. She's had about 30% turnover of her staff and is struggling to retain her existing staff members. There's concerns about pay, equity, flexibility, and when some staff leave, other staff are kind of going, well, maybe I can do better elsewhere as well. And so the more staff she has that are leaving, the more other staff think about leaving. And maybe the staff who were here at the beginning of the pandemic are tired, and 2 years in, they're starting to leave now. So she's gone through a lot of different changes in her staffing, and just turnover has been unlike anything that she'd ever experienced. Her organization does annual engagement surveys, and usually her team had pretty strong engagement scores, but they have gone down, and she's struggling to both meet the needs of her staff while also meeting business needs. And I'll add a layer of making sure that she feels taken care of and supported in her role. So my first question is, does this sound familiar? So for those who are leaders on this group here, what do you imagine might be some current issues faced by Maria as an FRC director? Totally familiar. Okay, so we're seeing some vicarious trauma. Some reading the mind. So I think we're all in the same boat. Absolutely familiar. Mental health of everyone. Turnover, continuity of services due to turnover, burnout, staff retention, client outcomes, doing more with less, hard time finding coverage, compounding staff problems and increasing workload, staff engagement, requirement to constantly transition and change, to keep and offer hope, burnout, constant emergencies because of being short-staffed. So you guys are experiencing clearly experiencing a lot of the same things as Maria during this process. So what I want to do is I want to ground us a little bit and take a step back about talking about trauma. Now, my guess is many of you have been on trainings about trauma. So this is not a trauma 101 training, but what this is a way. What I want to do is really get us thinking about some of the staffing issues in a different way than maybe we have because of articles in the press or some of the bigger conversations. And another thing I'd like to highlight is, I don't know about you, but as somebody who's really been doing trauma work for a long time and thinking about trauma-informed care for a long time, I've been really interested in how the language and the conversation about trauma has become very prominent over the last couple of years. And well, on the one hand, that shouldn't be surprising to us. and in some ways is validating if we've been doing this work for a long time and thinking about trauma. But on the other, I think it adds a new layer that suddenly folks who weren't using the language of trauma are using it, and that this is something that is kind of at the forefront of people's minds. The joke I like to tell is that there's, I was speaking with my mother-in-law who's not remotely in the trauma world, and she asked me if I had read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, because she was reading it. And if you haven't heard of it, it's a great book about trauma, but it's on the top of the New York Times bestseller list, which just tells us that not only are folks who do trauma work interested in trauma, now kind of the general population is interested in thinking about trauma, which is why this concept of trauma-informed leadership, from my perspective, is so important. So let's talk about it. Just a couple things. When I talk about trauma, I am not talking about something that is stressful. I know we could go into a whole different conversation about things like whether certain things are trauma or not. But when I'm talking about a traumatic experience, I'm really talking about something that threatens the life or physical integrity of someone or someone important to that person, that in that moment it causes an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, and horror, and produces this kind of intense physical effects such as pounding heart, rapid breathing, trembling, dizziness, loss of bladder control. And in some cases, this can continue over a period of time. And so our bodies kind of get adjusted to it, but we're always at this high level of awareness and what we call hypervigilance. So constantly paying attention to what is going on in our world, checking in all the time. So another term that I'd like to make sure we understand and are grounded in today is that of historical trauma. So that's a trauma or wounding that is shared by a group of people rather than individually experienced. And it spans multiple generations, so that those folks today, are affected by something that might have happened generations ago. So even if they didn't experience it directly. So if you think about things like slavery, internment camps, boarding schools, all of those things would really be considered a historical trauma. And what that also means is that events that occur today can be triggering for those historical events. Another term I'd like to ground us in is intergenerational trauma. So that refers to a specific experience of trauma across familial generations. It's not necessarily a shared group trauma. We're going to get to that in a minute, but really that it's if a parent has an experience of trauma and the child, it might be vulnerable to having a similar kind of experience to trauma. We certainly see that in a lot of cases that we serve, where the children come in because they've had some sort of physical or sexual abuse, and we find out that the parents have had a similar kind of experience. Or in cases of domestic violence, their parent might have an experience of trauma related to that, and the child might also have their own trauma as related to the domestic violence. And finally, or actually there's two more here, collective trauma. So this is maybe a newer one for folks. This is a psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affect an entire society. So the Holocaust would be really one of the prime examples of this. And the tragedy is represented in the collective memory of the group, which includes both a reproduction of the event, but also an ongoing reconstruction of the trauma in an attempt to make sense of it. So as we're thinking about this, I might just propose the idea that something like COVID that we've all been going through, where there's maybe different versions of loss, stress, constant vigilance about what is safe, what can you do, what can't you do, what should you do, what should you not do, all of the things that come with the various opinions about appropriate responses and how we all fall in different places on those continuum, that could be defined as a collective trauma that we have been experiencing for the last 2.5 years. Now, some scholars have suggested that we're actually in the middle of something called a syndemic trauma. And this is really some great work that's just currently emerging, and it's really refers to 2 or more health problems that coexist at the same time. So really this is quite common in more of the health literature, but some of our like Wisdom Powell is a great speaker, and she's proposed that racial trauma, all of the reckoning with racial justice issues that is currently happening, along with COVID, those 2 things together kind of create a little bit of a pressure cooker. And so we're all kind of experiencing these same things going on at the same time. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly felt this high pressure constantly. Now, why am I talking about this? We all know what trauma is. Why is this important, especially from a trauma-informed leadership perspective? Well, I would argue that if we're experiencing these things, our employees are absolutely experiencing these things, and they're in the same pressure cooker we are. And that's probably not a surprise to you, because as leaders, you've probably dealt with employees going out on COVID leave, frustration, turnover, all of the things that we've been dealing with, right? And I would argue that in addition to just reacting to what's going on in the world, there's actually some traumatic stress response that's going on. So what is a traumatic stress response cycle? So there's the event, and then there's that alarm system. Chances are you've heard about this alarm system. It's basically, you're driving in the car, a car cuts you off and you have to slam on the brakes. That's your body's alarm system in action. That's probably one of the simplest ways to think about the alarm going off. And then what happens is your body just releases a whole bunch of stress hormones, right? So the cortisol kind of shoots through the roof. And that's in the moment. Something that is healthy, right? We want to be able to respond quickly and kind of go to our reptilian brain when we're presented with these trauma experiences. The challenge is when these experiences go on over and over again for a high period of time, and that can lead to traumatic stress. Now, you guys are probably all familiar with things like fight, flight, and freeze. That's your body's alarm system actually responding. So I don't know if you've thought about what your response is. Sometimes I'm a fighter, sometimes I'm a freezer, and often I just want to fly, just walk away from the situation. So what I want you to do, though, is think about where your staff might fit in. So I might propose that staff members who start arguing at everything that you put out there might be doing a fight response. Staff members that keep calling out for work, they might be doing a flight response. And the staff members who just everything kind of seems dull, they're not really tuning in, they might be showing up for work, but maybe they're not as engaged, they might be doing more of that freeze response. So again, I would argue that what we're handling right now is this kind of collective trauma that our employees are experiencing, and we're seeing that in some of the challenges we run into as leaders. So why is this important? When individuals are in a reactive mode, so they're activating that fight, flight, freeze parts of their brain, we're seeing those behaviors. And when we can the way in which you combat this, right? So I've laid out my argument for why this might be a problem, but the way you might combat this is to actually take a step back. Like, remember, we have that kind of reptilian brain who's jumping in and responding, but the best way for us to move outside of that experience is to try to move into what we call our cognitive brain. So this frontal lobe part of our brain that's really responsible for planning and preparation and thought and all of those sorts of things. So that part of the brain comes after you've been stabilized. So what we want to do is create a space in our workforce where folks can step back, reflect, and get into their cognitive brain. But what I think is happening is that we have folks kind of spinning around in more of their reptilian brain. Okay, so trauma in the workforce. Our collective experiences of COVID have created a collective trauma, and COVID, along with many of the racial justice issues impacting our staff, had created a culture of what I might argue, and others have argued, a culture of syndemic trauma, and that a trauma-informed leadership approach is essential to truly meeting the needs of the current workforce. So just to ground us a little bit, what is trauma-informed care? These are the 4 R's. They were developed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration back in 2012. And it's kind of their basic understanding. Trauma-informed care seeks to realize the widespread impact of trauma, understand the paths to recovery, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in patients and families and staff, integrate that knowledge into policies, procedures, and practices, and actively avoid re-traumatization. So that's kind of the general definition of trauma-informed care. But as a leader, I think we have to think about it just a little bit differently. So we're thinking about trauma-informed practices. But one of the things, as you know, I've been training on trauma-informed care for a long, long time. And the focus has often been on what can we do to make sure staff feel safe, our patients feel safe, our work feels safe, our environments are safe. And often what I see happen is that we spend a lot of time on this compassion, and I've done it. I've absolutely done it. And I want to put it out there that everything we're talking about here, part of the reason that I want to talk about it is because they're the mistakes I've made. And I like to think that I'm not alone and that there's maybe a better way of thinking about these things. So we can lean heavily on compassion, right? Making sure this person gets the support they need. But we also have businesses to run, and we have tasks as leaders. We're kind of crunched in the middle there where our staff have needs and we have to keep the doors open. So one of the things that I personally found could be challenging is staff wanting so many things that if we gave that to them, our business wouldn't run anymore, and then they wouldn't have a job, right? And so, and I think about that, you know, as a trauma therapist, a lot of the work that we do includes good boundaries, accountability, and it isn't just about being nice. So we're going to dig more into that. But as a leader, I think our work is really about balancing that compassion and accountability. So here's what I think a trauma-informed leader really looks like. They're able to create physically and psychologically safe teams and environments. And we're going to dig into psychological safety, and hopefully you'll hear about it in a way maybe you haven't heard about it before. They're able to build trust between and among team members. They facilitate multiple opportunities for transparent communication. They engage in those tough conversations. I often find leaders maybe avoid those. I've certainly avoided those before. Turns out it doesn't work for anybody. The trauma-informed leader will just demonstrate compassion for staff experiences. So they will have that compassion, but they'll also hold staff accountable with clear boundaries and expectations. Because one of the things we often are tempted to do when things happen is to cheat, go, oh, well, we need to make things easier. And in the reality, good boundaries, good expectations, structure is actually what makes people feel safe, right? So if you think about kids, you know, when we do this work with kids and child trauma quite a bit, and what we'll find is, you know, a child might have a loss, and the family will be like, oh, well, I kept him out of school because he didn't want to go to school, and I didn't make him do this, and I didn't make him do that because he's grieving. And, you know, there's maybe a period of time where that's appropriate, but actually going back to the normal structure and the familiar structure creates that safety more than us, you know, thinking that we're protecting somebody. So I want to translate that into the work environment. So we can hold staff accountable with clear boundaries and expectations. And a trauma-informed leader has a space to be vulnerable and to take care of themselves. I was at a training last week, or a conference last week, and it was a great conference. And the whole focus, there were so many conversations about staff need this, we need to cater this workforce. And I agree with that, but I kept thinking that's all more for me to do as a leader. Everything that they're talking about is something that's being asked of me. And where is the space for me to try to do all this and meet the business expectations? So I think that's a conversation I'd love for us to have. So here's how I think about the trauma-informed leadership process. First, we really focus on trust and safety. So we're going to dig into that first. And then there's the next level is cultivating staff engagement in the work. And finally, acknowledging the systems in which staff live and work. So let's dive in to this foundation of safety and trust. So safety, if you've taken any trauma-informed care training, you're likely familiar with the work of Sandy Bloom and Brian Farragher. They talk about physical safety and they call it emotional safety or psychological safety. So physical safety being kind of the freedom from threats of violence, kind of this physical, you are safe in the world. It's being aware of risks in the environment and taking steps to ensure basic physical safety when there is a threat. Psychological safety, on the other hand, is really being safe to express your feelings, to be yourself, to have who you are, be okay. And your ability to create psychological safety in an interaction may increase you as a leader, your ability to create that safety helps that other person feel safe in that process. Okay, so those are kind of the basic definitions we've been using for a long time for safety. If you're not familiar, there's a great researcher out of Harvard, Amy Edmondson, and she talks about something called team psychological safety. And she's been talking about this for a long time. And I'd love to introduce that into the work that we do. And what she talks about is that team psychological safety is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Now, a safe team is a team in which folks like to be a part of it, and they're not as likely to leave the organization, right? Usually, well, things like pay, normal, they're moving because the cost of living in California is so high. Those are all kind of normal reasons for turnover. But when an employee tells you, I'm leaving because of interpersonal conflict, or because they're frustrated that things don't get done at work, or whatever it might be, that's a different conversation. And that's usually some sort of sign that there's a lack of safety on the team. So let's clarify though, what psychological safety is not. It is not about being nice. It is not about making sure people are happy. I've had situations where team members don't like a decision that I've made, and they say, and it might be about whether or not they should take a certain client. And I've done the whole risk and safety assessment. Everything bears out, but they don't like the decision. And they say, I don't feel psychologically safe. Now, what I might argue is that their ability to come and have that conversation suggests that they do feel psychologically safe. So it's just turning that on its head. It's not everybody being happy all the time. It's not everybody agreeing with the decisions that you make, because as a leader, the decisions that we make, the chance of everybody agreeing is pretty darn low, right? Psychological safety is not a personality factor. It's not just another word for trust. We're going to dive into trust in a moment. And it's not about lowering performance standards, right? So when I was talking earlier about, well, we decided that we might minimize, lower productivity. I understand why that might have needed to happen earlier in the pandemic. But maybe now it's not as, you need to kind of get the business back up and running. So it's not about lowering those performance standards. So here's the benefits of what psychological safety does. So it encourages speaking up. So one of the things that can happen among teams is when there is frustration, folks can hold information, right? They might have a freeze response as we're talking, right? I just don't want to have those conversations. I don't want to talk to the person. And if your team is anything like some teams that I've been a part of or I've led, those ideas fester. So it's really leaning into the conversations. And so when we have a safe team, they can actually have those conversations. So psychological safety alleviates concern about others' reactions to behaviors or actions that have the potential for embarrassment. It enables clarity of thought. So this comes back to moving from the reptilian brain to the cognitive brain. When the brain is activated by fear, we don't have room for anything else. I don't know about you, but when I'm anxious, even the most simple things become very hard that any other time I could do without thinking about it, right? Because our brain is using all of its energy to survive. And so when we get to move out of that, we can actually be thoughtful and have better conversations and decision-making and judgment. It also supports productive conflicts. So it allows for self-expression, productive discussion. Conflict, as it turns out, I hate it. I'll be honest. I don't know about you guys. I don't like it. But you know what? as I get older, as I learn more, I realize the more I have those hard conversations and lean into that conflict, the more we build trust and safety. Psychological safety helps to mitigate those failures. We're going to talking about failures, mistakes happen, but a good, a psychologically safe team, a psychologically safe environment is one where those failures just become part of an expected part of the work. And it turns out people make mistakes less when they feel like that is okay. I often joke that I'm really glad I'm not a brain surgeon, and that I actually make mistakes all the time. Other benefits are it promotes innovations. So removing the fear of speaking up allows people to actually be more creative and generate some possibilities that maybe they wouldn't have thought about before. It removes obstacles to pursuing goals for achievement. So they can focus on really motivating goals versus just like self-protection, right? They're not trying to watch their back all the time. And it also increases accountability. So rather than supporting kind of a permissive atmosphere, it creates a climate that supports people in taking risks and pursue those high standards and those challenging goals. So what does this actually look like? Psychological safety and team engagement. And again, there's a lot of research. Edmondson's done a whole bunch of research on this. So high psychological safety and low standards mean people are comfortable. And sometimes that is all you can expect, and that's okay. But we'll get to it in a minute. Low psychological safety and low standards means people don't care. They're not engaged at all. This is where turnover is going to be super high. Low psychological safety and high standards. So if you're constantly expecting many things, but you haven't created that safe environment, people live in anxiety all the time. And you know what like we talked about, what you're more likely to do when you don't feel safe and you're anxious, you're more likely to make mistakes. And then you create this cycle. So what we're really looking for is kind of this high safety, high standards of learning and high performance zone. So again, high balance of compassion and accountability. Okay, so what does it mean? What does a psychologically safe workplace actually look like? Maybe you work in one. Maybe you've got that all figured out. If so, we would all love to hear from you. But generally, a leader knows that psychological safety is present when people on the team say things like, we all respect one another. When someone bugs me, we're able to confront each other. Everyone in our group takes responsibility for what we do. And I don't have to wear a mask, and it's a figurative mask. I can just be myself. People can talk about mistakes and problems. It's understood that that's a great opportunity for learning. One of the things I say, I said it previously, I make mistakes all the time. Fortunately, not a lot of them are big mistakes, but I've also made big mistakes. And I'll tell you, once I make that mistake, once I don't make it again, and I'm much better and stronger. And I think about our staff in the same way. Mistakes are going to be part of it, and they're the number one way in which we learn if we create that learning environment for it to happen. But it needs to be okay that people make mistakes. Now, I understand I've certainly dealt with performance issues where people are making the same mistakes over and over again, and that's where the accountability really comes in. But really engaging in that conversation versus just trying to avoid it, right? And then the workplace is conducive to humor and laughter. I don't know about you, but we work in a place where we hear lots of horrible stories about horrible things that happen to children and families. And if a stranger were to walk down the hall and hear some of the jokes that are told, they might be unhappy about that or be like baffled by it, right? But the way we talk about it is you could either cry or you laugh. You got the feeling in there, it's going to come out somehow. You might as well build on humor. So what are some things that we can do in order to increase psychological safety? First one is promote self-awareness. Some of that's being your own self-awareness, tuning in to what about these things do I do really well? Because I bet of the things we're talking about, some of you do it really well. And then what are the things you find hard? I can tell you there's some things that I find hard and some things I think I'm actually pretty good at. Demonstrate concern for team members as people, right? So following up individually, this is the thing, by the way, that folks, particularly in the helping position, profession, are super good at. They care about their staff. They check in and see, they heard the husband had COVID, check in and see how the husband's doing. They check in on their kids. They actively solicit questions. And not only do they solicit the questions, but they actually take in the feedback and really try to answer them and address any issues that might emerge. So it's a meaningful conversation versus kind of, we've also heard of times where leaders ask, but they don't do anything with the information. They provide multiple ways for employees to share their thoughts. Turns out going into a group and asking people to share their feedback might work for a couple people, and then for half of them won't work at all, right? So how do we make sure that there's multiple ways for people to provide feedback? Show value and appreciation for ideas, even if it's not the direction you're going to go, really supporting this think outside the box mentality, because it turns out if we, one of my favorite quotes is, a system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So if we keep in the same lane, sometimes things don't change, right? So allowing for that innovation is important. Promoting this positive dialogue and discussion, that this is just part of what we do, build it in, be precise. And when I mean precise, this means really clear. So one of the things we learned is our attendance policy was being interpreted by people in a lot of different ways. So we had to really change and be very specific about our attendance policy, review it with staff, because staff were understanding it differently, leaders were understanding it differently. And so really kind of just, that was clear, that's an accountability thing, right? When changes happen, explain reasons for those changes, not just rolling them out. That can happen. And I will say, during COVID, as leaders, that was probably one of the most difficult things, because I know we would get guidance and suddenly everything had to change overnight. And then 2 weeks later, it had to change overnight again. And I found myself asking for grace a lot from staff members who had to, I hate the word, but pivot, right? Over and over and over again. And then owning up to your own mistakes. So the more you're able to own up to your mistakes and really move through them, the more you create an environment for staff members to feel the same way. So now let's think about the next kind of piece of the foundation. Now, psychological safety and trust are pretty intertwined, but I do want to kind of pull trust out a little bit. So when we think about trauma-informed care, trust and transparency, kind of what they're talking about is the operations and decisions are conducted with transparency, and the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff, clients, and family members of those receiving services, right? So that's great. But what does trust look like in a workplace? So Feltman has this definition of trust: choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. So it's really an interpersonal kind of trust. And I would argue that's the kind of trust that we need in order to develop our teams. Folks may or may not be a fan of Brené Brown. I love some of the work that she's come out with, and her work on trust is really great. She has this acronym. She took Feltman's work and then she kind of mixed it with kind of her own research, and she actually has several components of trust. And what I have found is there's some of these that I'm really good at, and that staff members are good at some of these. And then there are some that are hard and that we're really working on. So when we're talking about trying to create trust on our teams, I would argue that it's not like we don't trust each other and now we do. It is a continuum, that there be things that show up that suddenly you don't, you realize there were maybe some gaps in trust. So this framework for me really helps us think about the areas in which we might be strong in trust and the areas that might need some work. So the first one is boundaries. I've said boundaries a lot because I tell you, in trauma work, boundaries are critical. So when we're dealing with interpersonal boundaries, and I would say sometimes, particularly in child and family serving systems where we're dealing with things like abuse and trauma, and we have staff who might have had their own history of abuse and trauma coming into this work, and we're dealing with a world where there's kind of this collective trauma, boundaries become even more important, and having clear boundaries becomes even more important. So when we talk about interpersonal boundaries, we're talking about you respect my boundaries. And when you're not clear about what's okay and not okay, you ask, you're willing to say no, right? So that means I have good boundaries. And I know some people who have fantastic boundaries in this work. And I'm sometimes a little like, okay, that maybe that's a good thing, but it actually is really good, and it creates this safety, and it helps with those burnout issues. So you having really good boundaries, I mean, think about, maybe it's necessary for your role that staff can call you all the time, or maybe you've been doing that because you want them to feel that you're accessible, but now they're kind of walking all over that role. So that your boundary, right? So maybe think about what your boundary is there. What is necessary? And I would ask you to really think about what is necessary. I can't tell you how many leaders I've worked with who just say that they have to be available, but it's really their own anxiety about not meeting expectation. And it's not about the staff at all. That once we set the boundary for the staff, they actually respect it and they're fine with it. And it actually helps them feel better, because here's what happens. When your boundaries aren't as good, staff feel like they have to be as open as you, and they don't feel very good with that, right? And that contributes to the burnout. So really having that clarity and good boundaries about when you're available. When you go on vacation, I got to tell you, last year is the first time I went on vacation and I didn't check my email once, and it was amazing. And you know what? Everything was fine. And I actually realized that in the past, when I had checked in, I caused more problems than helping the situation, because I'd only get an email not knowing about the hallway conversation that happened to solve an issue. So me thinking I was meeting a need was actually adding fuel to the fire. So my boundaries help everybody have better boundaries. And I got to have a vacation where I didn't check my email, which was amazing. The next component is reliability. You do what you say you'll do, right? How many of you go, okay, I'll follow up with you on Friday about that, and that never happens, right? Happens to me sometimes too. You get overwhelmed. So really thinking about what is reasonable. And I'll tell you, I'm constantly trying to work around what that is and isn't. And if you can't make a deadline with your staff, you tell them why. My plan was to get this out by Friday. Turns out an emergency came up. I'm going to move it to this week. You doing that with your staff and expecting them to do that with you, again, helps create this trust that you're going to do what you say you do. And people they just feel better. I'm already feeling more calm talking about it. And I would invite you to think about what that feels like for you. Accountability. You own your mistakes. This is going to be a theme. Apologize and make amends. And I'm talking a real apology. Understand what the issue was and actually try to remedy it. Vault. So you don't share information or experiences that are not yours to share. I know sometimes, especially right now, there's just buzzy stuff going on, right? Everybody's so amped up. And anytime this thing happens, and we really had to take a look at this. I had to take a look at this. Our team had to take a look at this and really understand what is important to share, what is not important to share, what is relevant, not relevant, and what's not worth talking about, right? If it's somebody's personal life or something's going on with somebody at work, addressing the issue directly versus talking about it with people. I will say sometimes as leaders, you need support and you need to be able to talk to somebody in order to plan how you will handle a situation. And that is different than what I'm talking about, right? You're always going to need, I think it's great if you have a support system that you can talk to and then address the issue, but don't just talk about it and let it be, right? The next is integrity. So choosing courage over comfort. You choose what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. Practice your values simply by more than just professing them. And I've certainly run into some of those challenges, in that sometimes it's a lot. It turns out that the things you think are most important to do can actually be some of the hardest for you to do them. You would think if this aligns with my integrity, it's the easiest thing to do, but that's not actually always true. Non-judgment. I can ask for what I need and you can ask for what you need, and we can talk about what we need without judgment. So often what happens, particularly on our teams, is we have two coworkers who are talking. One is saying, well, I'm going to need, I can only do this, this, and this. And the other person is really frustrated and constructs all these hypotheses about the first person related to why they can't. Are they, lying? Are they, working the system? That's certainly something that comes up on teams. So it's really, maybe not judging, maybe just basing on the facts and pairing that with generosity. So extending the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, and actions of others. One of the great examples that I've heard is what if you imagine, let's think of your most challenging staff member, person that just like, oh gosh, here they go again with whatever it is, right? What if you imagine that they're doing their very best? It may not be up to the standard that you would like, but what does that mean? Maybe that means they're not the right person for the position, and that's fine, but they're doing their very best. How does that change how you might respond to them? I would hazard a guess that it makes you maybe more compassionate and warm. It doesn't change the accountability. It doesn't change the boundaries, but it creates a space where there's more clarity on how to handle the situation versus just assuming the worst of them. So how do we increase trust? Really being consistent, checking in, following up on whatever it might be, personal, professional, engaging in those hard conversations, question and encourage staff to question the stories we tell ourselves. This is one of my favorite ones. So we had a situation right when COVID came out where we had just written a grant to renew one of our core projects that's been around for a long time. And in that grant, we had written, we needed some new updating for the facility, right? That was something that was allowed in the grant, and it, new desks and furniture and painting and soundproofing and all the great stuff, right? So we had submitted this grant, and then COVID comes out and we get an opportunity to apply for additional funding to support kind of COVID response. And so that allowed for us to purchase furniture and, improvements in other programs. So we used the funding for those other programs. Well, lo and behold, the first grant ended up getting canceled. So this first team didn't get any of those improvements. All they saw was another team got these improvements. And I think at some point we probably told them that we wrote in the improvements, but their experience was, we didn't get this, that team did. Right? Now, if you've led multiple teams and you've had issues with equity, you know what I'm talking about. What I didn't know is there was a lot of whispering about why one team got it and then the other didn't. And eventually it came to me, and it was something about, there was somebody who was really like, she doesn't like our team, she likes these other teams better. That was the story that was being told. And so I was kind of shocked because we'd actually done a lot to try to get the same services for this one team. And so my work was actually repairing that, right? They had because I wasn't always communicating as clearly, there was this feeling about what was happening. But they also had these stories that they started telling themselves that just kind of went, kind of got out of control, and really were based on some assumptions that were being made versus some real concerns that were coming out. So there had to be a lot of repair work and engaging in those conversations. And it was not easy. And so really helping folk, one of the other things we had to do is this language of what is the story you're telling yourself is a really good one to use with your teams. I didn't just start by saying that language. I started saying it myself, like, oh, well, the story I'm telling myself right now is, and then other folks can start to use that language too. Because it turns out I've told myself a lot of stories that aren't true. So checking those out and working with your teams to check those out, because that is what really helps with creating some of that trust and support. And then finally, this comes back to the mistakes conversation, showing support for your team members, even when they make mistakes, and admitting your own. Okay, so the next part of trauma-informed care is peer support and mutual self-help. So again, Harrison Fallett, who kind of coined the term of trauma-informed care back in 2001, they talk about peer support and mutual self-help as integral to organizational and service delivery, and are understood as a key vehicle for building trust, establishing safety and empowerment. So they really build on both trust and safety. Okay, but what does this look like on your team? So it's really when staff provide support for each other. Isn't it great when our teams actually step up, they support each other, and they don't get frustrated? You know, if they keep supporting the same person over and over, they get frustrated. But wouldn't it be great if the person they supported yesterday is able to support them today, and they have this kind of this relationship where they can rely on each other? Because one of the things that burns teams out the most is when you feel like it's all on your own shoulders. And as leaders, we often feel like it's on our own shoulders. So it's something we need to think about too. So there's kind of three parts to this peer support. One is kind of the social, offering task assistance. And so we're going to start by talking about that. So task assistance. So this might be, you know, and again, as a leader, it's encouraging the environment where folks can offer each other, how can they support them, filling in as needed. And again, I know part of the issue we're dealing with right now is burnout and people feeling like they're always covering for staff who are leaving. And really making sure that we're trying to not overburden the one person who's always going to volunteer, because I'll tell you, that'll be the first person who's going to burn out and give their notice. And you're going to be like, uh-oh, here I am. The person who's always stepping up is the one that is leaving. But making sure that it's really thoughtfully done. And if things need to be, if we need to stop providing some service for a period of time, we just need to do it. You know, we've run into that recently because we're short-staffed on some nursing coverage. So we've had to adjust some of our medical. It's not great. I don't love it. But what we don't want to do is burn everybody out so that we're not able to provide those services down the road. It's going to have a financial impact. I get that, but we're going to hopefully be able to retain our staff. Strategy number 2 is facilitate opportunities for that social support. So really team members supporting one another when conflict comes up, be an ally to them when they need someone to help advocate for them or for their ideas, reassuring them of their worth. It's beautiful when team members are able to do this, and listen to their problems and offer guidance when they ask for it. So I have this great video I just wanted to share with you. You might have seen this on it's on Instagram, but it kind of made the rounds, and it is about a kid providing support for one of his teammates.
It's okay.
Everyone's older than me.
You don't have to tackle.
Bob, listen to me. No, Bob, listen to me. Trust me. Look at me. Look at me, Bob. I'm the shortest kid here. Listen, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're short, you're young. It doesn't matter if you're tall or hit. It doesn't matter if you're fat. It doesn't matter if you're tall. Bob, you are a brilliant rugby player. You understand that? You're insane. You're actually insane for your age. You're insane. Come here, give me a hug.
Best teammate
It's
ever.
all right?
Best
You're
teammate.
really good.
Come on.
Come on. So come on. No one. It doesn't matter.
So I see some hearts coming up. I think that's just such a brilliant way. You know, this kid, you just see him going far, right? He's gonna be a amazing leader someday. But really creating a space where our folks can really share some of that support with one another. And finally, providing feedback. This is a tough one. Positive feedback is really easy, right? And, you know, we talk about what feedback is and isn't. So reinforcing good behaviors by telling people when and how they've done a good job. acknowledging a job well done, you know, being really specific. I appreciate that you did this, this, and this, or you did this really well. So that's the easy part as a leader. The harder part is negative feedback. And I actually think that the term negative, I don't like very much. It probably should be more constructive feedback, and really about the person's area for improvements. Here's why this is important. Turns out nobody's going to be perfect. We all have areas in which we need to be better, and creating that environment where we all feel like that's okay to talk about. And then having a conversation with somebody to say, hey, you know, when I noticed when this meeting was being facilitated, people were really distracted. It seemed like it went all over the place. What are some ways in which we can fine tune the meeting, have the agenda be a little bit more tailored, so that people feel more engaged? What are some things that we can do? So sharing, you know, when something comes up, because here's the thing, that actually also builds trust. What they don't want to do is find out later that you didn't like how they did something and you never talked with them about it. So again, it's leaning into some of those hard conversations and providing some of that constructive feedback. Other strategies to increase peer support and mutual self-help, facilitating opportunities for staff to get to know and learn from one another. One of the things that we've learned is staff don't really understand what other folks do. So maybe facilitating shadowing opportunities or getting them involved in work groups across various teams so they really can start to build some of those relationships. Also things like peer supervision and consultation. It's great to have supervision with an identified supervisor, whatever that might look like given your particular setting, but ways for peers to work with each other as well. And then, of course, as I've said, this is strengthened also through the building of trust and psychological safety. So the next piece of trauma-informed leadership is really collaboration and mutuality. So in this, there is really a recognition that healing happens in relationships. Now, some folks are more touchy-feely and they need more of that. They're all about relationships. Some folks are like, you know what, I just come, I do my job, and that's it. But at the end of the day, if they could work anywhere, right? And we are learning, part of the challenge that we're running into with COVID is that folks are realizing they have a lot of different opportunities for work, right? So if they can work anywhere, why do they work at your organization? Is it because what you do is so important and you can kind of, it's rare? That's one of the things we've really tried to build on in our organization is if you're going to do this kind of work, we're going to be the place to do it because not a lot of places do all the things that we do. Or is it because the team is strong and supportive and people support each other and they all recognize that they're in this together? So the organization recognizes that everybody has a role. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, that it's all part of the team. So some great strategies to support collaboration and mutuality. One is just to make sure everybody understands the mission of your organization. That sounds really simple, but we have found that sometimes folks are really connected to that and sometimes they're not. Really share your expectation for collaboration, put that out there, define and communicate your team's goals, highlight individual strengths, promote a community working environment, and again, supporting, fostering this honest and open communication. So some other things to encourage that creativity. Again, we're talking about moving into that more cognitive brain where there's actually more space to move out of this trauma and to settle. I am hopeful we're going to be able to get to that space soon enough. Share some knowledge, insight, and resources. Lead by example. Get out of the office. So I know that different organizations have different systems for whether folks are working on site or if they're working remote. So this adds a whole new layer of what it means to collaborate. So try to, when you're facilitating as many opportunities as possible for collaboration, making sure that there's, you know, all the technology that needs to be in place, but there's also activities. And I would say, if possible, people are tired of Zoom. I so appreciate everybody being on this webinar today. It's amazing. And I also know that, oh my goodness, we are Zoom exhausted, right? I often, maybe not often, but have 8 hours of Zoom meetings a day, right? That's no good for anybody. So if there's ways to get out of the office, there's ways to facilitate some sort of team building activity where people can sit outside and be distanced from one another and come together, that would be great. You know, I went to a meeting last week that was the first in-person meeting of a group of people for years. And I got to tell you, the amount that everybody kind of walked away feeling fed and happy and connected again after the initial, we don't know how to talk to each other in person. It actually really was an amazing experience. And whatever we can do to kind of foster that. One of the things I get challenged by is everybody wants to work remote, which is great. But I do worry about what that means over time with folks not having connection. But I do think there are ways in which you can foster that connection, even if folks are working remotely. Invest in those collaboration tools. So that might be that technology. Facilitate meetings where there's more interaction, and of course, celebrate and reward successful teamwork. Okay, so the next one, really important, but again, these are kind of the strategies to help staff connect with each other. The organization aims to strengthen staff, client, and family members' experiences of choice. So this is really empowerment, voice, and choice. Okay, so building on what clients, staff, and communities have to offer rather than responding to perceived deficits. So that, again, is the definition that is used in the broader trauma-informed care literature. So if you've done a trauma-informed care training, no doubt you've heard about that. And it really is about having, you know, nothing about us without us language. So having family feedback, having clients be able to really be a part of the process. But how does this translate as a leader thinking about your staff members? So couple of, you know, suggestions on how we might do that. You probably already do some of this already, but when implementing change initiatives, identify the touch points in which staff feedback can be elicited and integrated. Okay, so often you might engage in things that and you might go, well, I want this to be fully cooked before I share it with staff, or only a couple of people are involved in this. And that might make a lot of sense. There might be some really specific reasons why staff can't be involved in something. But what I would invite you to do is to think about what are potential touch points for staff to be involved in this process. Before you embark on it, maybe have a communication plan. You know, one of the things that we did is we did a strategic plan in the last year, and it started with getting staff feedback at the very beginning on what's working, what's not working, and where they'd like to see us go. So that was a great place to get feedback. Then we collected it and we organized it, and of course, in that strategic plan, we have to think about broader organizational requirements and you know, system requirements and community requirements that maybe the staff aren't thinking about. So because that's not their job to think about. It's our job as leaders. So we did some of that work, and then we established priorities, and then we put it out again to staff for that. So finding the ways in which staff can be integrated into the work. Another way that we see this is the implementation of new practices. So if you read, Amy Edmondson has another great book called Teaming, and she has some great examples about, this is where she actually introduced the idea of psychological safety in this book. And it's about teams implementing a new technology, right? So really important stuff. And she was doing it in medical settings. And what they really found was that sometimes there are leaders who are so, they're kind of the expert in the field, And so they go, I know what to do. We're going to do this. We're going to move to this new technology, right? So think about maybe a MD researcher in cardiac, and he or she knows this really well and is like, we're going to do this, right? Those teams were actually not as successful in implementing change as teams where the leader knew a lot about it, but actually really incorporated the team into the implementation process. And of course, that aligns really well with what we know about implementation science, and the process that needs to be put in place about, exploring the issue, preparing, implementing, and sustaining. So thinking about where teams really, having work groups, having feedback from team members when you are rolling out these new initiatives, make them feel like they get to be a part of it, because it turns out they are, and they're the ones who actually have to do the work that we're putting out in the strategic plans. So how do we do that? Another kind of strategy is to acknowledge in transparent ways the areas in which staff may or may not have control or influence. So we're kind of laughing about the icebreaker today, and some of the responses. And, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody might respond something like, you get, 2 weeks where we pay for you to go on vacation, right? Staff would love something like that. As leaders, we know there's no way in which that can happen, at least in our businesses. Maybe if you're in a for-profit, those are the sorts of things that can happen for high achievers in sales or whatever. But in most of the time in child and family service work, there isn't the funds to do that. And so no matter, that's not something you as a leader are going to have any choice or influence over. So really being clear about what are the things that we as a team can work on? Either it's directly within our control, or it's something that could be is worth elevating up, right? So you have some influence over that. And then there are things that are just going to be outside of your control, right? And working with staff to really figure out what that is, because I've seen staff spin their wheels over things that are just completely outside of everybody's control, and it's just frustrating for everybody involved. But it's okay to say, we've laid out, there are things the actual language of control, influence, and then outside of our control, and then we try to use that when people get frustrated. And then finally, to create ongoing opportunities for staff to share their thoughts, concerns, feedback. So you likely have, engagement surveys, but are there other ways in which staff can meet with leadership and share concerns that are maybe different from surveys? One of the things that we found is that engagement surveys happen once a year, which is great, and you can, benchmark it and compare it year to year. But what about the thing that happened yesterday, right? That was frustrating. Is there a way to get quicker feedback on a situation so that we can address it more quickly? Because I got to tell you, one of my challenges is when I review an engagement survey that says, something like the team doesn't get along very well. I don't know what that means. If I think about the last year, were they thinking about, right at the moment they completed the survey, something was going on? Is this a systemic issue? So using those surveys, but not relying on those just for staff feedback. And finally, kind of the last layer of trauma-informed leadership is acknowledging the systems in which staff live and work. And so this really ties back to the conversation about cultural, gender, and historical issues. So again, kind of Harris and Fallett talk about the organization moves past cultural stereotypes and biases, provides culturally responsive services, leverages the healing value of traditional cultural connections, and recognizes and addresses historical trauma, right? So that's kind of their general definition. This area has always been important, and the importance has been highlighted in recent years. So what are some things that we can do in order to effectively really integrate this into the work, knowing that in many ways, the goalpost is going to continue moving on us. But as long as we're moving in the right direction and we keep steady and consistent, hopefully we're making some progress. So some strategies for this work is convening some DEI initiatives and work groups that are designed to really assess the processes and create true systematic change. That takes work. And the reason this is kind of at the top of the pyramid is it's really hard to do this work if there isn't trust and there isn't safety in teams. So a lot of work has to happen just for people to be able to have these conversations. We convened a work group. The work group's been going, we call it our anti-racism work group. It's been going on for quite some time. And I'll tell you, you know, it doesn't function like some of our other work groups. There's a lot of work and courageous conversations that have to happen and have happened, which make it really great work. But you can't really do much until that. Create spaces for staff to share concerns or support one another in these issues. So there's been a lot of things going on in the broader community that staff have been worried about. So what is a place for those conversations to happen? Because every staff member needs something different from their organization. So when something comes out in the news, somebody might be like, it's not related to my work. I don't care. I don't want to hear about it at work. And somebody else might be, I need my organization to take a stand about this. And then everywhere in the middle, right? So really thinking about what does that look like and how do you meet the needs for the staff members who need to have that versus those that really don't want, that's not where they want to spend their focus. Educate yourself, go to trainings, engage in some self-reflection, offer trainings to staff on these issues, and don't be afraid to be humble and communicate. I've stuck my foot in my mouth many times. I'm very aware. I'm a white woman leading an organization that we want to be really diverse and we want to reflect the children and families we serve, and I mess up, but that's where the trust and safety comes from, is that being allowed to make some of those mistakes and truly apologizing, recognizing them, and trying to correct behavior, because that's where trust and safety develops. So, you know, the last thing, as I was talking about earlier, is that when we've been hearing about all the things that organizations need to do to be better, right? So that's the conversation that happens across the board right now. It's like how, you know, you can't get on social media without saying, oh, this organization did this bad by this staff and this bad by this staff. And there's a lot of, you know, in some ways, I completely understand staff frustration. People have been working really hard. They've been working really hard through the pandemic. They were working hard before the pandemic, and they're constantly in the pressure cooker of need to do more on less, right? And that just got exacerbated greatly during the pandemic. I get that. But, you know, as I hear these conversations, I go, God, you know, it's really hard to be the person in the middle who has to support the staff and also has to be accountable to my leadership. And I'm guessing a lot of you are in a similar situation. Leadership can be lonely. So you're focusing on the staff needs and the organizational requirements. One of the things that I ran into is this kind of push to be available. Can you show up to this meeting? Can you show up here? Can you do this? Can you come talk to these people? That can be exhausting, right? Because you're constantly trying to meet everybody's needs. And this constant expectation about what you should know more and do more. So how do we do this? And I would argue that a lot of what we've talked about in this training, in terms of setting boundaries, having clarification, clarifying your zone of control, really engaging in the tough conversations, that is really important, right? But I would also say prioritize, take care of yourself. You know, one of the things that I learned I had to do is I have to have my work day has to end at a certain time. I personally don't do good when I'm expected to check emails at 10 p.m. at night, right? So, and fortunately, one of the perks of the workforce, kind of the generational stuff, is that I find that the kind of next generation of workers are frustrated by leadership kind of expecting them to always be available and don't want to be available. So you have an opportunity to kind of use that and be okay with it and set that boundary. You will feel better, your staff will feel better. but also creating peer support. So if there's ways you can connect with other leaders to kind of talk through some of these things, or either within your organization, or if you have other leaders in the community, just to kind of have somewhere to go. Because like our staff need to have peer support, we as leaders need to have peer support as well. So how do we make this stick? Well, as any culture change, it's going to take some work, but some of that is just putting it into policies and procedures. That's the accountability piece. You get those written down, you roll those out to your staff, you make sure they're clear, and it might be things that you don't currently have policies on, but just for expectations for accountability, and then enforce them, right? Enforce them. Organizational mission and vision, making sure folks know what that is. Having a sense of values for your organization, and using implementation science principles to institute a change in culture, right? So trying some things out. What would it take for us to build more trust as a team? Start small, pilot test some things, use small tests of change. And then some active integration. That's really just code for practice. Do it over and over and over again, but also making sure that you're taking care of yourself throughout this process. So that was a lot of information. So I'm going to open it up to questions at this point, and I already see there's a couple in the Q&A. So I'll just go ahead to the top here. How does collective trauma differ from historical trauma? So I think that's a great question, and there is a lot of actual intersection between the two. I would say collective trauma might be something that is kind of broad across a whole kind of system. It might be across the whole country, whereas historical trauma might impact more of a selected group of people. But there is going to be a lot of intersection between those things. And then the next question is, what are some ways to elicit feedback in a more timely fashion? One of the things we're trying, and again, I don't know if this is going to work, but this goes back to the small tests of change, is incorporating kind of a weekly feedback. How did the week go? You know, 2 questions that your staff might answer about how they're feeling about 2 things you might be interested in that they do on Friday before they leave. And then you check it out, and then you can check in with them after. So it's actually more feedback during the week that's quick and easy versus kind of these long feedback surveys. We've done a similar thing with our families. So we have client satisfaction surveys, and we work with a bunch of partners in the community, and they do kind of surveys every 6 months. We started having them complete a quick survey when they leave our center. They come in to our center to get some for the services we provide. And when they leave, they answer 3 questions, and that's how we get some quick feedback. So it doesn't have to be big, but it just has to be something that is easy and can get you that feedback in real time. And then the next question, you mentioned the need to get out of our reptilian brains and shift into our cognitive brains. One of the things we found is the need for folks to be in touch with and aware of the emotional reactions they are impacting how they behave. I think that's a great point. Have you found this to be the case? And if so, how are you building emotional capacity bandwidth to equip staff to do the work needed at the affective level? Well, some of that, that's a great question. So thinking about, I think it's really about checking in. One, I think the use of this language is really important. So you can actually, let's see, I'm sorry, the question just, okay. So it's really about, I'd say giving language. So once people have language for that's more their reptilian brain versus that's more their emotional brain versus their cognitive brain, they're able to do it. But it also, we integrate mindfulness and we make the connection. So we've had times where groups do like a 5-minute mindfulness within their team meetings, or it's integrated into the work throughout the day. So it's really kind of practicing some of the skills that they might be, that we're talking about. And so I hope that kind of answered the question. Let's see, we talked about, Any more strategies you've used to create psychological safety with your team? Well, in particular for a new leader, honestly, I think it's slowing down, getting to know folks, really focusing on clear expectations, relationship building, and being clear in communication. So I think all the strategies I talked about, but if you're kind of a new leader on a new team, I would take everything down a notch and slow it down. Let folks know you want to get to know them. You want to get to know what they do, that it's important that for you, in order to support them, you don't kind of run and jump ahead, and to just do everything in terms of clear communication, really kind of getting folks to think about what makes them feel safe versus what doesn't. And honestly, I would recommend anybody read the Edmondson book. It came out in 2019. I'm trying to remember the name of the book itself, but it's on psychological safety in teams. You can look that up. I would actually recommend new leaders read that as well. We have experienced folks, staff and clients being burnt out on surveys. Are there other ways to get more feedback, more frequent feedback? The other things you could do is, if you wanted to, you could convene, kind of have a little bit of feedback within team meetings. That'd be another way to do it. You could have open office hours where folks could come and talk to you. So if they don't want to talk out in the team, they could come in and meet with you. You know, I think it's thinking about the different ways people communicate. So sometimes it's in writing, sometimes it's in person, sometimes it's just kind of figuring out, maybe there's a little, but I would emphasize that it's small and it doesn't need to be a big thing that needs to happen. So that kind of constant open door policy. I'm an ED with executive director with 7 employees. How often do you think I ought to have a private meeting with each employee? There have been so many performance issues over the last 2 years that I've had so many meetings with some of them, but for ones that are performing well, I'm trying to figure out how often to have that private meeting with them and to share feedback. So one of the things I've done is I'll start weekly, but with the folks that are maybe don't have the performance issues, it might be bi-weekly, and it could be for 30 minutes, but that constant check-in, just knowing that you're there and that you're supporting them. So, you know, I have some, you know, I'm fortunate I have some really great direct reports, and I meet with them every 2 weeks. Some of them, it might be once a month for an hour, but just making sure you have that time. And then of course, that's where the availability comes in for those folks, knowing that you might check in with them. Hey, how did this thing go? So they know that they can come to you if anything comes up in between your normal meeting time. Okay. Oh, the title of the Edmondson book. I'm going to have to, we will look that up. We can make sure to send that out as part of the resources. I apologize, my brain, talk about reptilian brain. I'm in presenter mode, not remembering name of book mode. So we'll get that out to you. And how can we get this training for our organization? That we could certainly talk separately about that. Let's see. Oh, fearless organization. That's it. Yep. Great book on boundaries, to set boundaries, find peace. I've read that one. It's a really good one. Yep, The Fearless Organization. And Teaming is her earlier book where she introduces psychological safety. Okay. Okay, and then Jennifer Tucker Tatlow. Here's another great resource my team has found to be helpful regarding racialized trauma and the needs to engage hearts and bodies as we work to address and heal. So there's a great resource in the chat for folks there. Oh, there's just such good stuff. Okay, let's see, are there any other questions? I think maybe we got them all, Jennifer.
It looks like it. Do you want to go on to your next steps, and then we'll wrap up for the day?
Perfect. Okay, so next steps. So you have a handout that's available. So there was a question on how to do more on psychological safety. So there's actually a great handout that is being shared on how to foster psychological safety in your teams. The braving worksheet that Brene Brown created that I built from, that's in there as well. So there's some great stuff for you to review and reflect on your own strengths and areas to grow. And then this is my information. If you wanted to reach out, my email is on here as well. So I will pass it back to you, Jennifer.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. I can tell just from listening to this how useful it was for me, and then also seeing the comments in the chat, how people found this so very helpful. So thank you once again for a great presentation.